The letter in Evelyn Price's trembling hands promised everything: a husband, a home, a future in Wyoming territory. 3 days she'd waited at Dustmere Station, her wedding dress gathering prairie dust, watching strangers' pitying glances slice through her dignity like winter wind. The rancher who'd sent for her didn't exist. The money was gone. Hope was dying. Then a child's voice shattered her despair. "My daddy needs a wife. Will you marry him instead? Sometimes the wrong train delivers you exactly where you belong. I invite you to follow this story to the end and comment your city below so I can see how far this tale has traveled." The bench at Dustmere Station had worn smooth from countless travelers, but none had sat there as long as Evelyn Price. 3 days, 72 hours of watching the horizon swallow trains that never brought the man who'd promised to marry her. Her fingers traced the letter's edges until the paper softened like old silk, the ink beginning to blur where her tears had fallen. "My dearest Evelyn." The letter began in handwriting that had seemed so confident, so sure. "By the time you read this again, you'll be Mrs. Thomas Hartley, mistress of the finest cattle ranch in all of Wyoming territory." Except Thomas Hartley didn't exist. The telegraph operator had confirmed it that morning, his weathered face creasing with the kind of pity reserved for fools and abandoned dogs. No Hartley Ranch. No Thomas Hartley registered anywhere in the territory. Just another marriage swindle, another Eastern woman lured west with promises as empty as the prairie wind. "Miss..." The station master, Jedediah Burke, approached with the careful steps of a man approaching a wounded animal. His boots scraped against the platform's warped boards. "Miss Price, isn't it? The westbound's coming through in an hour. I could arrange passage back east. The railroad company sometimes makes allowances for situations." Evelyn's spine straightened through the effort cost her. 24 years old, and she'd already been marked as one of those women, the ones who'd gambled everything on a letter and lost. Back in Philadelphia, they'd shake their heads. "Poor Evelyn Price," they'd whisper. "Always did have more dreams than sense." "I'm not going back." The words surprised her with their steadiness. Burke shifted his weight, his shadow falling across her dusty traveling dress. "Miss, you can't just sit here forever. This ain't no place for a woman alone. Dustmere's rough territory. We got cowboys, miners, all sorts passing through." "I said, I'm not going back." She stood her legs protesting after hours of stillness. The platform seemed to tilt, or maybe that was hunger making the world unsteady. Her last piece of bread had been breakfast yesterday. Pride, it turned out, was difficult to digest. Burke pulled something from his vest pocket, a silver dollar. "For food, miss. There's a boarding house 2 streets over. Mrs. Holloway runs a clean establishment." The coin glinted in the afternoon sun like a small accusation. Charity. She'd come west to escape exactly this, the suffocating pity of being Evelyn Price, the schoolteacher whose father died in debt, leaving her with elegant handwriting, a thorough education, and absolutely nothing else. "I have money," she lied, her empty purse weighing against her hip like a stone. "Course you do." Burke set the coin on the bench beside her carpet bag. "That's just Western hospitality." He retreated to his office, leaving Evelyn alone with the vast Wyoming sky. It stretched endlessly, a blue so sharp it hurt to look at. Nothing like Philadelphia's familiar gray ceiling. Here, the sky didn't care about your circumstances. It simply was beautiful and terrible and completely indifferent. She picked up the silver dollar, its weight both salvation and defeat. The sound of boots, small ones, made her turn. A child stood at the platform's edge, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing men's boots that swallowed her feet and a dress that had seen better decades. Prairie dust painted her dark hair gray, and her eyes were the color of sage honey too, knowing for such a young face. "You're the bride, ladies," the girl announced. Not a question. "I'm nobody's bride." The words tasted bitter. The girl tilted her head, studying Evelyn like she was a puzzle missing pieces. "You've been sitting here 3 days. Whole town's talking about it. Mrs. Holloway says you're probably touched in the head. Mr. Giles thinks you're running from the law, but I think you're just sad. And what would you know about it?" "I know sad." The girl stepped closer, her oversized boots clomping against the boards. "My mama knew sad too before she died. She used to sit like you're sitting all straight and careful, like if you hold yourself just right, you won't break into pieces. Evelyn's throat tightened. Where's your father? Working. Always working. That's why I came to find you. The girl's small hand reached out, dirt caked under her fingernails. Will you marry my daddy instead? The question hung in the air like dust motes, absurd and desperate in equal measure. Child, you can't just people don't. Evelyn stopped, struck by the earnestness in those honey eyes. What's your name? Clara. Clara Callahan. My daddy's Samuel Callahan, and he needs a wife real bad even if he don't know it. He can't braid hair and he burns everything he cooks, and sometimes he forgets to talk for whole days. Clara's words tumbled out in a rush. But he's good. He don't drink like Mr. Watson, and he don't hit like Mr. Briggs used to hit Mrs. Briggs before she ran off. He just gets real quiet, like he's listening to something nobody else can hear. Clara, sweetheart, you can't just collect a wife for your father like picking up a stray cat. Why not? You need a husband. He needs a wife. I need a mama. Clara's logic was devastating in its simplicity. You're pretty enough even with all that dust on you, and you got all your teeth I checked when you were sleeping yesterday. You were watching me sleep. Only for a minute. Had to make sure you were suitable. Clara pulled something from her pocket, a crust of bread wrapped in a handkerchief. Here, I saved this from breakfast. Daddy won't miss it. The bread was hard as stone, probably 2 days old, but Evelyn's stomach cramped at the sight of it. She took it with shaking fingers, dignity crumbling like the crust between her teeth. See, Clara said, satisfied. You're hungry. We got food. Not fancy food, but plenty of it. Daddy shot an elk last week. Clara, Evelyn began, but the child had already grabbed her carpet bag with surprising strength. Come on, it's getting late and Daddy don't like me walking after dark. Makes him go all tight around the eyes. She started dragging the bag toward the platform steps. You can decide about marrying him after you meet him, but even if you don't want to marry him, you can stay for supper. We got elk stew. Evelyn stood at the crossroads of her life, looking between the empty train tracks leading back east and this strange child with her overlarge boots and desperate honey eyes. The rational choice was clear. Take Burke's charity. Buy a ticket home. Become the cautionary tale she was always meant to be. But rationality had led her to believe Thomas Hartley's letters. Rationality had said a correspondence courtship was perfectly respectable. Rationality had left her stranded on a train platform with nothing but a fraudulent promise and a stranger's pity. How far is your ranch? She heard herself ask. Claire's face split into a grin that transformed her from solemn child to something bright and wild. 3 miles north. Daddy'll be surprised, but good surprised, I think. Maybe. Maybe? Well, he don't like surprises much, but he likes help, and you look helpful. Evelyn laughed, actually laughed for the first time in 3 days. It felt rusty, like a gate that hadn't been opened in too long. I suppose I am helpful. Can you cook? Yes. Can you sew? Yes. Can you make hair look pretty? I can try. Then you're already better than Daddy at everything important. Clara started walking, still dragging the carpet bag, leaving Evelyn no choice but to follow or lose her only possession. The town of Dustmere sprawled around them as they walked, a collection of wooden buildings that looked like they'd been dropped from the sky and landed wherever they pleased. The saloon leaked piano music and laughter. The general store's windows displayed goods Evelyn couldn't afford. People watched them pass the abandoned bride following the Callahan girl like a lost sheep. Don't mind them, Clara said. They got nothing better to do than stare. Mrs. Holloway once watched Mr. Giles scratch his backside for 10 whole minutes, just because it was Tuesday and nothing else was happening. Despite everything, Evelyn smiled. You're very observant. Daddy says I notice too much, says it isn't ladylike. Clara corrected herself with obvious effort. Mama used to say isn't instead of ain't. She was from Boston. Daddy tries to remember, but sometimes the Texas comes out. Your father's from Texas. Born there. Came up here after the war. Said Texas got too complicated. Clara navigated around a drunk cowboy without breaking stride. Everything got complicated after Mama died. When did she pass? 2 winters ago. Fever took her right before Christmas. Daddy wrapped all the presents she'd hidden, but his hand shook so bad the paper tore. Claire's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I pretended not to notice. They left the town behind following a rutted wagon trail into the grassland. The prairie stretched endless grass rippling like water in the wind. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still wearing caps of snow despite the spring warmth. It was beautiful and terrifying, all that space, all that sky, making Evelyn feel small as a seed. There, Clara pointed ahead. That's home. The Callahan Ranch squatted against the landscape like it was trying not to be noticed. The main house was built solid but simple logs chinked with mud, a porch that wrapped around two sides. A barn stood off to the left, its red paint fading to the color of dried blood. Smoke drifted from the chimney, the only sign of life. Daddy's inside, Clara said, and for the first time uncertainty crept into her voice. Maybe I should tell him first, prepare him. Clara, this isn't... I can't just... Please. The girl turned those honey eyes on Evelyn, and they were filled with the kind of hope that could break hearts. Just try, just for supper. If Daddy's too difficult, you can leave after. I'll walk you back myself, but please try. Evelyn thought about the platform bench, about the pitying looks about the letter she still carried like a wound. Then she looked at this child who'd brought her bread and dragged her carpet bag 3 miles because she needed a mother badly enough to recruit one from a train station. Just supper, she agreed. Clara's smile could have powered the entire territory. She pushed open the door, calling out, Daddy, I brought company. The house smelled of wood smoke and burnt something meat, possibly. The main room combined kitchen and living space with a large fireplace, a table that had seen better decades, and furniture that prioritized function over comfort. But it was cleaned meticulously, so everything in rigid order, like someone was afraid chaos would creep in if given the slightest opportunity. A man emerged from the back room, and Evelyn's first thought was that he looked like he'd been carved from the landscape itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that needed trimming. His clothes were work-worn but clean, and his hands, she noticed his hands immediately were scarred from labor, but gentle in their movements. But it was his eyes that stopped her breathing. Gray as winter storms, they held the kind of weariness that came from carrying too much weight for too long. When they landed on her, she saw confusion, then alarm, then something that might have been fear. Clara! His voice was deep, rough from disuse. Who is this? This is Miss Price, Clara announced, as if that explained everything. She's staying for supper. Samuel Callahan looked from his daughter to Evelyn, those storm-gray eyes taking in her dusty dress, her desperate respectability, her carpet bag that Clara had deposited by the door like a declaration of intent. Miss Price, he said slowly, like he was tasting the words. The bride from the station. So he knew. The whole town knew. Evelyn's shame burned fresh. She's not anybody's bride, Clara said firmly. She's just Miss Price, and she's hungry, and we have elk stew. Clara. It's Christian Charity Daddy, like Reverend Morrison's always talking about. We can't just let her starve at the train station. What would Mama say? The mention of his wife hit Samuel like a physical blow. Evelyn saw him flinch, saw his hands curl into fists, then deliberately relax. Mr. Callahan, Evelyn found her voice. I apologize for the intrusion. Your daughter was concerned for my welfare. I'll gladly be on my way if... You walked 3 miles. It wasn't a question. He was looking at her boots worn through at the toes. Yes. In those shoes? Yes. Carrying that bag. Clara helped. Something shifted in his expression so subtle she almost missed it. Clara's 8 years old. I'm almost 9, Clara protested. She's 8 years old, Samuel repeated. And she carried your bag 3 miles because she was worried about a stranger. Yes. He studied her for a long moment, and Evelyn felt like he was seeing straight through her carefully maintained composure to the terrified, desperate woman beneath. You'll stay for supper, he said finally. Not an invitation, a statement of fact. Clara, show Miss Price where she can wash up. And change your dress. That one's got more dirt than fabric. Clara grabbed Evelyn's hand, pulling her toward a door. That's Daddy's way of saying welcome. He don't use many words, but the ones he uses he means. The room Clara led her to had clearly been the master bedroom once. Now it held only a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk. Everything that might have been feminine had been removed, leaving only the bones of a space once filled with life. This was their room, Clara said unnecessarily. Daddy sleeps in the barn most nights now. Says the house feels too full of empty. Evelyn poured water from the pitcher into the basin, surprised to find it fresh and warm. Your father seems complicated. He wasn't always. Mama used to make him laugh, real laughs, the kind that came from his belly. Now he just works and worries and forgets to eat unless I remind him. Clara perched on the bed, watching Evelyn wash the travel dust from her face and hands. That's why you should marry him. You could remind him to eat too. Clara, marriage it's not just about reminding people to eat. I know that. It's about other things too, like having someone to talk to when the dark gets too heavy, like knowing someone will notice if you don't come home, like not being alone when the fever comes and there's no one to bring water. The child's words carried the weight of experience no 8-year-old should have. Was your father able to bring water when your mother had the fever? He tried. He sat with her 3 days and nights, didn't sleep, didn't eat. Told her stories about when they first met, about building this house, about all the things they do when she got better. Clara's voice went hollow. But she didn't get better. And after she died, Daddy stopped telling stories. Evelyn dried her hands, slowly choosing her words with care. Grief changes people. I know. It changed me too. I used to be afraid of the dark. Now I'm afraid of the silence. Clara stood smoothing her dirty dress. I better change before Daddy gets upset. He doesn't like disorder. She left Evelyn alone in the room that felt haunted by another woman's absence. Every missing detail told a story: the rectangular fade on the wall where a mirror once hung the empty hooks that might have held dresses, the lingering scent of lavender sachets long since removed. Evelyn opened her carpet bag, pulling out her one clean dress. It was nothing special, dark blue wool, practical and plain, but it was clean and it fit, and it didn't carry the dust of her humiliation. She changed quickly, trying not to think about how she'd imagined this moment differently. She should be changing into her wedding dress in Thomas Hartley's house, preparing to meet her husband, not washing up in a dead woman's room while her daughter tried to recruit a replacement. When she returned to the main room, Samuel was at the stove stirring something in a large pot, with the concentration of a man diffusing dynamite. Clara sat at the table now, wearing a dress that was clean, but too small, the hem hitting above her ankles. It smells wonderful, Evelyn said, though in truth it smelled slightly scorched. Samuel glanced at her, and something flickered in those storm-gray eyes. The blue dress, perhaps, or just the sight of a woman in his kitchen again. It's edible, he said. Usually. Daddy's being modest, Clara said. It's definitely edible. Mostly. Despite herself, Evelyn found her lips twitching toward a smile. Can I help? No? The word came out sharp, and Samuel seemed to realize it. I mean, you're a guest. I'm a woman who knows her way around a kitchen, Mr. Callahan, and I've been sitting for 3 days. I'd welcome the activity. He stepped back from the stove like it might bite him. If you insist. She moved to the pot, assessing the situation. The stew was salvageable, just needed attention. She found salt, pepper, and surprisingly dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Thyme, she said, surprised, and sage. Mama grew them, Claire explained. Daddy keeps them even though he doesn't use them. She said they made everything taste like home, Samuel said quietly, then seemed surprised he'd spoken. Evelyn added herbs to the stew, adjusting seasoning, stirring with the confidence of someone who'd stretched too many meals when money was tight. The familiar rhythm of cooking settled her nerves, gave her hands something to do besides twist together in anxiety. You know what you're doing, Samuel observed. My mother taught me. She said a woman who can't cook is like a bird who can't fly, capable of surviving but missing something essential. Your mother sounds wise. She was. She died when I was 15. Evelyn kept stirring, not looking at him. Consumption. My father followed 2 years later. Heart gave out, the doctor said, but I think it was grief. Some people aren't meant to be alone. The kitchen fell silent except for the bubble of stew and the pop of wood in the fireplace. Clara watched the adults like they were performing a play she didn't quite understand but desperately wanted to see the ending of. "The bread's in the warming box," Samuel said finally. "If you want to slice it." They worked in careful parallel, not quite together, but not apart, navigating the kitchen like dancers who'd forgotten the steps but still heard the music. Evelyn found plates, Clara set the table. Samuel poured water from a pitcher that didn't quite shake in his hands. The stew was better than edible. It was good. The elk meat was tender. The vegetables, root vegetables that had wintered in some cellar, gave it substance, and the herbs brought warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "This is how Mama made it," Clara said, wonder in her voice. Exactly how she made it. Samuel's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully, precisely, like it was made of glass. "I should check the horses," he said, standing abruptly. "Daddy, you already—" But he was gone, the door closing with careful control behind him. Clara's face crumpled. "I shouldn't have said that. About Mama. I always say the wrong thing." "No, sweetheart." Evelyn reached across the table, covering the girl's small hand with her own. "You said exactly the right thing. Sometimes the right things are just the hardest to hear." They finished eating in companionable silence, Clara sneaking glances at the door, waiting for her father to return. He didn't. "He goes to talk to her," Clara explained as they cleared the dishes. "In the barn. Her grave's out back, but he says the barn's where he feels her most. They built it together before I was born." So Evelyn washed while Clara dried, the domestic rhythm strangely soothing. This wasn't her house, wasn't her life, but for just this moment she could pretend. Pretend she belonged somewhere, was needed by someone, had a purpose beyond being the woman foolish enough to believe in fairy tale letters. "You should stay," Clara said suddenly. "Not forever if you don't want, but for a while, until you figure out where else to go." "Clara, we have room. That bedroom you washed in, nobody uses it, and Daddy needs help even if he won't say so. The ranch is too much for one man. He's exhausted all the time, and he won't hire hands because he says he can't afford them, but really I think he just don't want strangers around." Clara dried a plate with focused intensity. "You wouldn't be a stranger. You'd be useful." "I don't know anything about ranching." "You can learn. Mama did. She was from Boston, remember? Never seen a cow until she met Daddy. But she learned everything: how to birth calves, mend fences, break horses. Daddy taught her, and he could teach you. Your father doesn't want— My father doesn't know what he wants anymore. He's like a clock that stopped working when Mama died. Still tells time twice a day, but that's just coincidence, not function." Claire's insights were too sharp for her years. "Maybe you could wind him up again." The door opened before Evelyn could respond. Samuel stood in the doorway, backlit by the dying light, and for a moment he looked like a spirit himself, caught between worlds, not quite present in either. "Storm's coming," he said. "Can smell it on the wind. Miss Price, you'll stay tonight. Can't have you walking back in weather." "I couldn't impose." "Already imposed," he said bluntly. "Might as well impose until morning when it's safe to travel." Clara made a small sound of victory that she tried to disguise as a cough. Samuel's eyes narrowed at his daughter, reading her plotting as clearly as text. "Just tonight, Clara. Miss Price has her own life to figure out." "Yes, Daddy," Clara said meekly, but her eyes danced with plans. The evening settled around them like a blanket. Samuel returned to work, ledgers spread across the table, calculating numbers that never seemed to add up right. Clara sat by the fire with a primer, practicing her letters with painful concentration. Evelyn found herself darning stockings she discovered in a basket, the kind of mindless work that let her thoughts wander. This could be her life. This quiet domesticity, this careful dance around grief, this slowly healing household. It was nothing like what she'd imagined when she'd answered Thomas Hartley's advertisement. That had promised romance, adventure, a grand love story across the frontier. This was just life. Complicated, messy, difficult life with real people who carried real pain and real needs. "Your letters are backward," Samuel told Clara, voice gentle. "Remember the B faces, right, like it's walking forward." "Walking forward to where?" Clara asked. "Wherever it needs to go." "What if it doesn't know where that is?" Samuel looked up from his ledgers, caught Clara's eyes, then his gaze drifted to Evelyn. Then it keeps walking until it figures it out. The storm hit just after full dark wind howling like wounded animals, rain hammering the roof with violent intensity. The house shuddered but held, built to withstand worse than weather. "Spring storms," Samuel said, closing his ledgers. "They're angry about something, but they never last long." "Unlike winter storms," Evelyn asked. "Winter storms aren't angry, they're just indifferent, which is worse somehow." He stood stretching muscles tired from sitting. "I'll get blankets for your room. Gets cold when the wind blows through the chinking." He disappeared into a back room, leaving Evelyn and Clara by the fire. "He's different tonight," Clara whispered. "He talked more at dinner than he has in weeks." Change unsettles people. Good unsettled or bad unsettled? "I don't know yet." Samuel returned with an armload of quilts that smelled of cedar and thyme. "These were in the trunk," he said, not quite meeting Evelyn's eyes. "They're clean." One quilt slipped and Evelyn caught it. Her fingers recognized the pattern immediately: wedding ring design, each interlocking circle made with fabric scraps that told stories. A piece of yellow that might have been a summer dress. Blue from a work shirt. White that could have been christening clothes. "She made that," Samuel said quietly. "Sarah, my wife. She said every quilt should tell the truth about the life that made it." "What truth does this one tell?" He was quiet so long Evelyn thought he wouldn't answer. "Then, that even scraps can make something beautiful if you're patient enough to piece them together." Clara yawned elaborately. "I'm tired, Daddy. Really tired." Samuel's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "Bed, then. Both of you." He lit a lamp for Evelyn, handed it to her with hands that weren't quite steady. "Thank you," he said. "For dinner. For making it taste like home again." Before she could respond, he was gone back into the storm, probably to the barn where he could talk to ghosts without witnesses. Claire showed Evelyn to the spare room. That's what they were calling it now. Not the room where Sarah died, just the spare room. It was clean but cold, the wind finding every gap in the logs to whistle through. "There's a warming pan under the bed," Clara said. "And if you get scared, you can come to my room. Sometimes I get scared and go to Daddy's room, but he's usually not there, so I just curl up in his empty bed and pretend." "Pretend what?" "Different things. Sometimes that Mama's just in the kitchen making breakfast. Sometimes that Daddy's the way he used to be. Sometimes that I'm brave enough not to need pretending." She hugged Evelyn suddenly fiercely, her small arms surprisingly strong. "Please stay," she whispered. "Not for marriage, or forever, or anything big. Just stay for a little while. We're so tired of being alone." Then she was gone, leaving Evelyn in a dead woman's room with a storm raging outside and a different kind of storm building inside. She sat on the narrow bed, still holding the wedding ring quilt. Every stitch represented hours of work, of care, of love transformed into something tangible. Sarah Callahan had made this while alive, vibrant, probably humming while she worked. Now it was all that remained of those hands, that heart that life cut short. Evelyn thought about her own trunk sold to pay for the journey west, about the quilts her mother had made also sold, about all the pieces of her life she'd scattered behind her like breadcrumbs, hoping they'd lead somewhere better than where she'd started. The storm raged on, and somewhere in the barn, a man was talking to his dead wife about the woman sitting in her room, wrapped in her quilt, wearing a blue dress that probably reminded him of 100 other blue dresses that would never be worn again. This wasn't the adventure Evelyn had imagined. It wasn't the romance Thomas Hartley had promised. It was harder and sadder and more real than anything she'd prepared for. But it was also warm and dry and safe. There was food and shelter and a little girl who needed someone to braid her hair. There was a man drowning in grief who'd still offered kindness to a stranger. There was work that needed doing and a place that needed filling, not replacing Sarah Callahan, that was impossible, but simply being present in the space her absence had created. The lamp flickered, casting shadows that danced on the walls. Outside, the storm began to ease, its anger spent. Tomorrow, she could leave. Take Samuel's carefully offered escape and walk back to the station, back to decisions about east or west, about what came next for a woman with no money and no prospects and no fairy tale ending waiting. Or she could stay. Not forever. Claire was right about that. But for a while. Long enough to help with spring planting. Long enough to teach Clara proper letters. long enough to see if Samuel Callahan could remember how to be more than a ghost haunting his own life, long enough to figure out if Evelyn Price was meant to be more than just a forgotten bride on a train platform. She pulled the quilt around her shoulders, its weight comforting as an embrace. In the pattern of interlocking rings, she traced the outline of one circle, complete in itself, but stronger for its connection to the others. The wind whispered through the logs, and if she listened carefully, she could almost hear it saying something that sounded like, "Welcome home." But that was just fancy, just the kind of romantic notion that had gotten her in trouble in the first place. This wasn't home. It was just shelter in a storm. Still, as she lay down in the narrow bed, still wearing her blue dress because unpacking felt too much like commitment, she allowed herself one small moment of possibility. Maybe not all promises were lies. Maybe some were just delayed taking forms you didn't expect arriving through the voice of a child in oversized boots instead of letters from non-existent ranchers. Thunder rolled across the prairie one last time, and in its echo, Evelyn heard the sound of her old life ending and something else unknown, uncertain, but undeniably real beginning. The morning arrived with the kind of pristine clarity that only follows storms, as if the world had been scrubbed clean and hung out to dry. Evelyn woke to find sunlight streaming through gaps in the logs, painting golden stripes across the wedding ring quilt. For a moment she forgot where she was. The narrow bed, the unfamiliar walls, the lingering scent of another woman's life all seemed part of some elaborate dream. Then she heard Clara's voice drifting from the kitchen, high and bright. "Daddy, you're burning the eggs again." Reality settled back around her like a comfortable weight. She dressed quickly in yesterday's blue dress, her only clean one now, and tried to tame her hair into something resembling respectability. The small mirror above the washstand showed a woman she barely recognized. Cheeks flushed from prairie wind eyes that had lost their city pallor, the beginning of something that might have been determination setting around her mouth. The kitchen scene that greeted her was one of controlled chaos. Samuel stood at the stove, spatula in hand, looking at a pan of eggs like they'd personally betrayed him. Clara sat at the table already dressed, but with her hair resembling a bird's nest after a particularly violent windstorm. "Good morning," Evelyn said, and both Callahans turned to her with identical expressions of relief. "Miss Price." Samuel said his formality at odds with the dawn light softening his features. "I was attempting breakfast." "Attempting is the right word," Clara added helpfully. Without thinking, Evelyn moved to the stove, gently taking the spatula from Samuel's hand. Their fingers brushed just barely, just enough for her to feel the calluses from years of rope and leather, the warmth that radiated from skin used to working in all weather. "May I?" she asked. He stepped back immediately, almost gratefully. "Please." The eggs were indeed burned but salvageable if you scraped carefully and didn't mind a slightly smoky flavor. She worked quietly, aware of Samuel's eyes on her as she moved around his kitchen with increasing confidence. The bacon was easier to rescue, and there were biscuits in the warming box that just needed attention. "I can braid your hair after breakfast," she told Clara, who bounced in her seat with delight. Really proper braids, the kind that stay, the very kind. Samuel poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been percolating since the beginning of time, the liquid black as tar and probably twice as thick. He set a cup near Evelyn's elbow, not handed to her directly, she noticed, but placed within reach. Everything he did seemed to maintain that careful distance, as if getting too close might disturb something fragile. They ate in relative quiet, but it was a different silence than the night before. This had the quality of morning routine of people settling into patterns. Clara chattered about the horses, about a hawk she'd seen hunting mice, about anything that crossed her quick mind. Samuel responded with nods and occasional words, but his attention seemed split between his daughter and the woman who'd materialized in his kitchen like something conjured from desperate need. After breakfast, Evelyn sat Clara down and began working through the tangles in her hair. The child winced, but didn't complain, too pleased with the attention to protest the necessary discomfort. "Mama used to sing when she braided my hair," Clara said softly. Evelyn's hands stilled for just a moment. "What did she sing?" "Church songs, mostly. Sometimes funny ones about frogs and princes." Clara tilted her head back to look at Evelyn upside down. "Do you know any songs?" "A few." "Will you sing them?" Evelyn glanced at Samuel, who had returned to his ledgers but was clearly listening. His shoulders were tight, braced as if for a blow. "Perhaps another time," she said gently, resuming her braiding, "when I've remembered all the words properly." Samuel's shoulders relaxed incrementally. The morning developed its own rhythm. Clara showed Evelyn around the house, every corner, every hiding place, every squeaky board that might wake someone if you were trying to sneak to the kitchen for midnight water. The root cellar with its stores of potatoes and turnips and mysterious preserves in jars whose labels had long since faded. The smokehouse where meat hung like strange curtains. "Daddy built all this," Clara said proudly. "Him and Mama together, but mostly him. He's good at building things, just not so good at maintaining them lately." Indeed, Evelyn could see the signs of neglect, not willful, but the kind that came from one person trying to do the work of two. Fence posts that leaned like tired soldiers, gates that hung askew, a chicken coop that had seen better decades. "We used to have chickens," Clara explained, following Evelyn's gaze. "But after Mama died, a fox got in. Daddy just never replaced them. Said it was one less thing to worry about, but I think he just couldn't bear to start something new." They were interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. Samuel appeared from the barn, rifle in hand, his whole body alert. But it was just a neighbor, Mr. Henley, from the adjacent ranch, his weathered face creased with what might have been concern or curiosity. "Sam!" he called out, not dismounting. "Heard you had company." News traveled fast on the prairie, Evelyn realized. Probably Mrs. Holloway's doing. "Miss Price," Samuel said simply. She was stranded by the storm. Henley's eyes found Evelyn took in her clean dress and Clara's neatly braided hair, and something knowing flickered across his features. "The bride from the station." "Just Miss Price." Samuel corrected his tone, carrying a warning. "Of course." Henley touched his hat brim to Evelyn. "Ma'am, welcome to the territory. Rough land, but it grows on you if you give it time." "Like a fungus," Clara added, helpfully earning a sharp look from her father. Henley chuckled. "That's one way to put it. Sam, I'm headed to town later if Miss Price needs passage back to the station." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Evelyn felt both men watching her, waiting for her decision. Even Clara had gone still, her small body tense with hope she was trying not to show. "That's very kind, Mr. Henley," Evelyn said carefully. "But Mr. Callahan has offered me temporary employment. I'll be staying on for a while to help with the household." Samuel's head turned sharply toward her. They hadn't discussed this, hadn't agreed to anything beyond breakfast. But she met his storm-gray eyes steadily, chin lifted slightly as if daring him to contradict her in front of his neighbor. "Employment," Henley repeated his tone, suggesting he wasn't buying it for a second. "Well, that's practical. Very practical." Samuel agreed, though his voice carried undercurrents Evelyn couldn't quite read. "Miss Price has experience with household management." "I'm sure she does." Henley's smile was just shy of a smirk. "Well, if you need anything, Miss Price, the Henley Ranch is just 5 miles east. My wife would be pleased to have female company. It's lonely for the women out here." After he left trailing dust and unspoken speculation, Samuel turned to Evelyn with an expression that mixed confusion, irritation, and something that might have been reluctant admiration. "Employment?" he asked. "Would you prefer I'd taken his offer of a ride? He stopped, clearly wrestling with himself. "We can't pay much. Room and board would be sufficient. You don't even know what the work entails. I can learn. Ranch work is hard." "Mr. Callahan," Evelyn interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. "I've been sitting on a train platform for 3 days, waiting for a man who doesn't exist, with every person in town watching my humiliation. I can handle hard work. What I can't handle is more pity." He studied her for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time not the desperate woman from the station, but someone else, someone with steel beneath the desperation. 3 months, Fa, he said finally. "Trial period. If it doesn't work for any of us, you're free to go with no hard feelings, and a month's wages to see you wherever you need to go." Agreed. Clara, who'd been holding her breath, exploded into motion, hugging Evelyn's waist with fierce joy. "You're staying. You're really staying." "For now," Samuel cautioned. But his daughter wasn't listening. already chattering about all the things she could show Evelyn, all the ways life would be better now. The rest of the day fell into what Evelyn would later recognize as the beginning of a pattern. Samuel worked the ranch checking cattle, mending the worst of the fences, the endless labor of keeping civilization carved out of wilderness. Clara shadowed Evelyn as she took inventory of the house, making lists of what needed doing, what could wait, what was beyond saving. The kitchen was well stocked but disorganized, as if someone had been putting things away in the dark. The main room needed attention. Dusty corners, windows that hadn't been cleaned since Sarah died, curtains that were more suggestion than fabric. But the bones of the house were good solid, built to last by hands that cared about permanence. Mama's sewing basket is in the trunk, Clara offered when Evelyn mentioned the curtains. Daddy won't mind if you use it, I don't think. The trunk sat at the foot of Samuel's bed like a closed door to the past. Evelyn hesitated before opening it, feeling like an intruder, but practicality won. Inside Sarah Callahan's life lay folded and waiting fabric thread needles, half-finished projects that would never be completed by the hands that started them. There was also a photograph wrapped carefully in silk. A woman with Clara's honey eyes and Samuel's determined chin, wearing a dress that managed to be both practical and pretty. She was smiling at something beyond the camera's range, probably at Samuel himself directing the photographer. She looked happy. Not the forced happiness of formal portraits, but genuinely radiantly alive. That's her, Clara said from the doorway. That's Mama. She was beautiful. Daddy says I look like her, but I think he just wishes I did. Clara came closer, tracing the image with one finger. Sometimes I forget what she looked like. Then I remember all at once, usually when I'm not trying, and it hurts like falling off a horse. Grief is like that, Evelyn said, rewrapping the photograph carefully. It ambushes you when you least expect it. Does it ever stop? I don't know. I'll tell you when I find out. They took the sewing basket, but left the photograph in its silk shroud. Some things weren't ready to be disturbed. The afternoon brought unexpected challenges. A cow had gotten tangled in wire fencing and was bellowing her distress to the entire territory. Samuel was in the far pasture, and the animal's increasingly panicked thrashing threatened serious injury. We have to help her, Clara said, though she stayed well back, respecting the danger of flailing hooves. Evelyn had never dealt with cattle in her life, but she'd watched her father calm horses when he'd still had his small delivery business. The principle had to be similar. Steady voice, slow movements, no sudden surprises. Get me a blanket, she told Clara, and rope. The girl ran off, returning with both. Evelyn approached the cow slowly, talking nonsense in a low, steady voice. The animal's eyes rolled white with fear, but the continuous sound seemed to calm her slightly. I know, Evelyn murmured. This is undignified and uncomfortable, but we're going to fix it. Just hold still for me. She managed to get the blanket over the cow's head, blocking her vision. In the temporary darkness, the animal stilled. Working quickly, trying not to think about the fact that she was within range of hooves that could cave in her skull, Evelyn began untangling the wire. Her hands were bleeding by the time she finished. Wire was unforgiving, but the cow was free. The animal stood for a moment, shaking beneath the blanket. Then Evelyn pulled the fabric away and stepped back quickly. The cow looked at her with what might have been gratitude or might have been profound irritation, then ambled away with as much dignity as a recently panicked bovine could muster. You did it! Clara danced around Evelyn like a small tornado. You saved her. I just untangled some wire. Daddy! Clara shouted, spotting her father approaching on horseback. Miss Price saved Bessie. Samuel dismounted, taking in the scene, the discarded wire, Evelyn's bleeding hands, the cow now placidly grazing, as if nothing had happened. Let me see what, he said, reaching for her hands. She pulled back instinctively. They're fine. They're bleeding. His voice carried a note of command she hadn't heard before. Infection's no joke out here. Reluctantly, she let him examine the cuts. His hands were gentle, despite their size turning hers to catch the light, assessing damage with practiced eyes. Not too deep, he concluded, but they need cleaning. Come on. He led her back to the house, Clara trailing behind, providing unnecessary commentary about Evelyn's heroism. At the kitchen pump, Samuel worked the handle while Evelyn held her hands under the cold water, hissing as it hit the cuts. Hold still, so he said, producing a flask from somewhere and pouring the contents over her wounds. The whiskey burned like fire, and Evelyn bit her lip to keep from crying out. "Sorry," Samuel said, not sounding sorry at all. "But better this than fever." He wrapped her hands in clean cloth with the efficiency of someone who'd dealt with plenty of injuries. His touch remained clinical careful, but Evelyn was aware of every point of contact, every brush of calloused finger against her wrist. "Thank you," she said when he finished, "for the doctoring." "Thank you," he countered, "for saving my cow." "Our cow, sir," Clara corrected. "Family cow." Something passed across Samuel's face at the word family, but he didn't correct his daughter. Supper that night was quieter, all three of them tired from the day's unexpected adventures. Evelyn managed despite her bandaged hands, though Samuel watched her struggle with her spoon for exactly 3 minutes before standing and moving her bowl closer, cutting her meat into smaller pieces without comment. "I'm not helpless," she said. "Never said you were. But no point in making things harder than necessary." He sat back down, returning to his own meal, as if he hadn't just performed an act of casual kindness that made her throat tight. After Clara went to bed, yawning through her protests that she wasn't tired, Evelyn and Samuel sat by the fire in companionable silence. She was attempting to darn stockings one-handed, which was going about as well as expected. "You're going to make it worse," he observed. "Probably." "Then why continue?" She considered the question. "Because stopping feels like giving up." "On darning?" "On everything." He was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. "Clara told me what you did, with the cow. It needed doing. Most people would have waited for help. The cow didn't have time to wait." "No," he agreed. "Things rarely do out here." He paused, seemed to be weighing words. "You did well today." "Is that approval I hear, Mr. Callahan?" "It's observation, Miss Price." But there was something almost like warmth in his voice, and when Evelyn glanced at him, she caught the faintest suggestion of a smile before he schooled his expression back to neutrality. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, setting aside the hopeless darning. "How does it work? What needs doing?" So he told her, his voice finding a rhythm as he described the cycles of ranch life, calving season, branding, the autumn drives to market. The constant battle against weather and predators, and the land itself that seemed determined to reclaim any ground humans thought they'd won. He spoke of water rights and grazing disputes, of the delicate balance between having enough cattle to make a profit and having too many for the land to support. Sarah understood it all, he said, then seemed surprised he'd mentioned her. She kept the books, managed the contracts. "I can work the land, but she worked the numbers." "Is that what you were struggling with in the ledgers?" "Everything's behind, taxes, payments, supply orders. I know cattle, not arithmetic." "I could help," Evelyn offered carefully. "I taught school. Numbers were part of the curriculum." He looked at her directly, then those storm gray eyes holding a mixture of hope and suspicion. "Why would you do that?" "Because I'm here. Because it needs doing. Because—" She paused, choosing honesty over easy answers. "Because I need to be useful. I need to earn my place, not just occupy it." "You don't owe us anything." "No," she agreed. "But that's not the same as not wanting to help." He stood abruptly, the conversation apparently reaching his limit for emotional complexity. "I'll get the ledgers tomorrow, show you the system, such as it is." "I'd like that." He paused at the door to his room. He was sleeping inside tonight, she noticed. "Miss Price?" "Yes." "Clara was right. About the hair. It looks proper. The braids." Then he was gone, leaving Evelyn alone with the dying fire and the strange warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. The next few days developed their own rhythm. Mornings began with Evelyn making breakfast while Samuel did the early chores. Clara would stumble out half awake, and Evelyn would braid her hair while the coffee percolated. They'd eat together, conversation minimal but comfortable, then scatter to their various tasks. Samuel taught her about the ranch in practical ways, how to spot a sick cow, how to check fence lines, why water sources needed constant monitoring. He was patient but not patronizing, correcting her mistakes without making her feel foolish. "You're not afraid of the work," he observed on the third day, watching her help him reset a fence post. Should I be? Most city women would be. I'm not most city women. No. He agreed, something unreadable in his expression. You're not. Evening, she worked through his ledgers, untangling 2 years of grief-delayed bookkeeping. The situation was worse than she'd expected, but not irretrievable. They were behind on taxes, but not in foreclosure territory. Several contracts had lapsed that could be renegotiated. You need to sell more cattle this year, she told him one evening, showing him the numbers. 20 head, maybe 25. That's a quarter of the herd. It's that or lose the ranch to back taxes. He stared at the numbers like they might change if he looked hard enough. Sarah would have caught this months ago. Sarah's not here, Evelyn said gently. But the ranch is. Clara is, and you are. That has to be enough. Is it? He asked, and she understood he wasn't really asking about the ranch. It has to be, she repeated, and this time it sounded like a promise. The breakthrough came unexpectedly through Clara's fever. It started as a sniffle progressed to a cough, and by the fourth night the child was burning up. Samuel paced the floor like a caged animal, while Evelyn bathed Clara's forehead with cool cloths, coaxing water between cracked lips. We should get the doctor, Samuel said for the 10th time. The doctor is 15 miles away and it's past midnight, Evelyn reminded him. By the time you got back, the fever will have either broken or… She stopped, not wanting to voice the alternative. Sarah's fever didn't break, he said hollowly. This isn't Sarah. Clara's young strong. She'll fight this. But privately, Evelyn was terrified. The child's skin felt like paper that had been too close to flame dry and fragile. Her breathing came in short gasps, occasionally interrupted by coughs that shook her small frame. Mama, Clara called out in delirium. Mama, it hurts. Samuel made a sound like something breaking. He started for the door, but Evelyn caught his arm. She needs you here, she said firmly, not riding off into the dark. Here. I can't watch this again. You can. You will, because she's your daughter and she needs her father. He sank into the chair beside Clara's bed, taking his daughter's small hand in his large one. Hey, little bird, he whispered. Daddy's here. Tell me a story, Clara murmured, not quite conscious but responding to his voice. About Mama. Samuel's jaw clenched, but he began to speak, his voice rough with disuse and emotion. Your mama came to Wyoming wearing the prettiest dress I'd ever seen. Completely impractical, all lace and ribbons, and about as useful as a screen door in a blizzard. But she wore it like armor, like it could protect her from everything the territory might throw at her. Evelyn continued her ministrations, but she listened, hearing in his words a love story she hadn't expected. First thing she said to me was, "You're not what I expected." And I said, "Neither are you." Because I'd been expecting someone delicate, someone who'd need protecting. But your mama, she looked at this land that scares most people and she said, I can work with this. Through the night, he told stories. How Sarah had learned to shoot hitting a can on her first try through sheer determination. How she'd delivered a calf in a snowstorm wearing her wedding dress because there hadn't been time to change. How she'd stood up to a group of cowboys who'd been harassing a native family, fierce as any warrior. She saved me, he said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. I was just existing before she came, going through motions working the land because I didn't know what else to do. But she made everything mean something, even the hard days, especially the hard days. Near dawn, Clara's fever broke. Her breathing eased and natural sleep replaced the restless unconsciousness. Samuel slumped in his chair, exhausted, still holding his daughter's hand. You saved her, he said to Evelyn. We saved her, she corrected. Your stories called her back as much as my cold cloths. I haven't talked about Sarah since… He stopped, swallowed hard. It hurt too much. I know. Do you know what it's like to lose the person who makes you make sense? Evelyn thought about Thomas Hartley's letters, about the future she'd imagined, about sitting on that platform, realizing everything she'd believed was a lie. It wasn't the same losing something real versus losing something imagined, but the grief had its own validity. I know what it's like to lose the person you thought would make you make sense, she said carefully. It's not the same, but it's not nothing either. Samuel looked at her, then really looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as the desperate woman from the station or the help he'd reluctantly accepted, but as a person with her own losses, her own grief. "I'm sorry," he said, "about your Thomas Hartley. He wasn't mine. That was the problem. Still, to hope for something and have it not exist, that's its own kind of death." Clara stirred, mumbling something about pancakes. Both adults smiled. If she was dreaming of food, she was going to be fine. "Thank you," Samuel said suddenly, "for staying, for fighting for her when I was too scared to." "You weren't scared. You were terrified. There's a difference." "What difference?" "Scared people run. Terrified people sometimes freeze, but they don't leave." "Didn't leave." The sun broke through the window, painting the room gold. Clara's breathing was easy now, normal. The crisis had passed. Samuel stood, stretching muscles cramped from hours in the chair. "I should check the animals. I'll make breakfast. Evelyn." He stopped, her name hanging between them. It was the first time he'd used it, and they both noticed. "Yes." "Nothing. Just nothing." But his hand brushed her shoulder as he passed, the lightest touch, barely there, and then gone. But Evelyn felt it like a brand marking some shift in what they were to each other. Clara woke properly around noon, demanding food and complaining that her hair was a mess. The relief in the house was palpable, like the air after a storm when you realize the roof held and the windows didn't break. "You stayed," Clara said to Evelyn wonderingly. "When I was sick, you stayed." "Of course I stayed. But you're not my mama." "No," Evelyn agreed carefully, working through the tangles in Clara's hair. "But I'm here." "That's almost as good," Clara decided. "Maybe better because you chose to be here. Mamas have to love you. It's a rule. But you don't have to do anything, and you stayed anyway." That evening, Samuel brought something to the dinner table besides food, a small wooden box worn smooth from handling. "I've been thinking," he said, not quite meeting anyone's eyes, "about what's fair, about what's right." He opened the box, revealing a simple gold ring. Not ornate, not expensive, but solid and real. "This was my mother's, he said. Not for what you might think, but as collateral. You're working here helping us, and I've got no cash to pay proper wages. But this has value. You could sell it if you need to leave, start over somewhere. It's yours to keep whatever happens." Evelyn stared at the ring, understanding what it cost him to offer it. This was trust, or the beginning of trust. This was acknowledgement that she'd earned her place here through more than pity or convenience. "I can't accept this," she said. "You can, and you will." His voice was firm. Sarah would have wanted— He paused, took a breath. "Sarah would have wanted whoever helped Clara to have security. This is what I can offer." Evelyn picked up the ring, feeling its weight. It was warm, as if it remembered being worn. "I'll keep it safe," she promised. "Until you can afford to pay proper wages, then you can have it back. That might be a while. I'm not going anywhere." The words hung in the air, heavier than intended. Clara looked between them with the bright-eyed interest of a child sensing adult undercurrents. "Good," Samuel said finally. "Because Clara needs consistency. Children need to know the people in their lives will stay." "Just Clarita?" Evelyn asked, surprised by her own boldness. Samuel's eyes met hers, storm-gray depths holding something that might have been fear or might have been hope. "No," he said quietly. "Not just Clara." The weeks that followed Clara's recovery brought an unexpected ease to the Callahan ranch, as if her fever had burned away more than just illness. Samuel began taking his morning coffee at the kitchen table instead of standing by the door ready to escape. He started leaving his ledgers out where Evelyn could work on them without asking permission. Small changes, but in a household that had been frozen in grief, even small thaws felt momentous. It was during one of these morning coffees that trouble arrived in the form of Marcus Briggs, the territorial tax assessor whose reputation preceded him like a bad smell. His wagon kicked up dust visible from a mile away, giving them just enough time for Samuel's jaw to tighten and his knuckles to whiten around his cup. "He's early," Samuel said, voice flat as old beer. "Not due for another month." "Maybe he's just passing through," Evelyn suggested. though the purposeful way the wagon turned toward their gate suggested otherwise. Marcus Briggs doesn't pass through. He circles like a vulture looking for weakness. Samuel stood his chair scraping against the floor. Clara, go to your room. But Daddy. Now. The child disappeared, but Evelyn knew she'd be listening from behind her barely closed door. Children had a way of being present even when absent, especially when adults were trying to protect them from something. Briggs was a man who seemed to have been assembled from spare parts that didn't quite match nose, too large eyes, too small limbs, too long for his torso. But it was his smile that made Evelyn's skin crawl, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes and suggested he knew things about you that you didn't know yourself. Samuel, he said, not bothering to remove his hat. Heard you had some help around here. Miss Price is employed as household assistants, Samuel said carefully. Briggs's eyes found Evelyn traveled from her carefully pinned hair to her worn boots with an assessment that felt like being inventoried. The bride from the station. Interesting career change. Is there something we can help you with, Mr. Briggs? Evelyn asked, keeping her voice steady despite the urge to step behind Samuel. Just checking on the tax situation. Seems the Callahan ranch is considerably behind. He produced a ledger from his coat, licking his thumb before turning pages with theatrical slowness. 3 months behind, to be exact. That's approaching foreclosure territory. We have until the end of summer, Samuel said. That was the agreement. Agreements change. Territory needs funds now, what with the railroad expansion and all. Briggs's smile widened. Of course arrangements could be made. I've always admired this piece of land. Might be willing to take it off your hands for a fair price. The ranch isn't for sale. Everything's for sale, Samuel. Just a matter of finding the right currency. His gaze slid to Evelyn again. Sometimes it's not even money that talks loudest. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. Samuel took a step forward, and Evelyn saw his hands curl into fists. State your business or leave, Samuel said, each word careful and precise as a loaded gun. $200 by month's end, or I start foreclosure proceedings. Briggs tipped his hat to Evelyn with mock courtesy. Ma'am, pleasure to see the station bride found herself a situation, though I wonder what kind of situation exactly. He was in his wagon and gone before Samuel could respond, leaving dust and implications swirling in his wake. $200, Samuel said to the empty air where Briggs had been. Might as well ask for the moon. We'll find it, Evelyn said, though she'd seen the books and knew how impossible that amount was. Samuel turned to her, something raw in his expression. This isn't your debt to carry. No, but it's my home now, too. The words slipped out before she could catch them. Samuel went very still. Is it? Before Evelyn could answer, Clara burst from her room. I have $17 saved. From birthday money and finding Mr. Henley's lost calf and... You were listening, Samuel said, but there was no heat in it. Everyone was listening. Mr. Briggs has a voice like a rusty gate. Clara thrust a small cloth bag at her father. It's not much, but it's a start. Samuel knelt, bringing himself to his daughter's eye level. Clarebird, I can't take your savings. It's not taking if I'm giving. She crossed her arms stubborn as only an 8-year-old could be. This is our ranch. All of us. We protect what's ours. That night, after Clara had gone to bed clutching her depleted money bag like a security blanket, Samuel had taken only $5 just to make her feel included. Evelyn spread the ledgers across the kitchen table like battle plans. 20 head of cattle at current prices would bring maybe $150 tip, she calculated. We need another $50 minimum. The horses, Samuel said reluctantly. That bay mare would bring good money. The mare Clara's been training, the one she talks to every morning, like it understands her. Horses don't care who owns them as long as they're fed. But Clara cares. Samuel rubbed his face, exhaustion carved into every line. Then what do you suggest, because I'm out of ideas that don't involve losing something we love? Evelyn studied the numbers again, then looked up at the rafters where Sarah's herbs still hung dry and fragrant. An idea began forming, wild and possibly foolish, but no more foolish than believing in letters from a non-existent rancher. What if we don't sell what we have, she said slowly. What if we add value to it instead? Speak plain. Mrs. Henley mentioned last week that she can't get good butter or cheese anywhere closer than Cheyenne. Same with preserves, pickled vegetables, anything that requires what she called a woman's touch. What if we didn't just sell cattle? What if we sold what we could make from what we have? That's work on top of work. Yes, but it's work I know how to do. My mother sold preserves and pickled goods when times were tight. I helped her from the time I could hold a stirring spoon. Evelyn leaned forward, warming to her plan. We have milk cows, a root cellar full of vegetables, wild berries growing by the creek. We just need sugar, vinegar, some canning supplies. And time, and labor, and someone to buy it all. The general store would take goods on consignment. I already asked Mr. Peterson hypothetically when I was in town last week. She'd actually been thinking about it since seeing the empty shelves where such goods should be. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, and Evelyn could practically see him weighing practicality against pride. It's not ranch work, he said finally. It's not what we do here. What you do here is survive, Evelyn countered, by whatever means necessary. You do all this extra work on top of everything else. We do it. Clara can help, she's old enough, and you'd be surprised how much can be accomplished when foreclosure is the alternative. Samuel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark land that 3 generations of Callahans had worked. My grandfather would roll in his grave knowing I'd reduced the ranch to selling preserves like some homesteader's wife. Your grandfather isn't here, and I'd bet he'd rather see you keep the land through preserves than lose it through pride. When Samuel turned back, there was something different in his expression. Not quite hope, but the possibility of it. What would you need? They stayed up past midnight making lists, calculating cost, planning logistics. Samuel knew a supplier who might extend credit for canning supplies. Evelyn sketched out production schedules working around ranch duties and Clara's schooling. It was ambitious, bordering on impossible, but it was something, and something was better than the nothing they'd had before. The next morning brought unexpected allies. Word of Briggs's visit had traveled Prairie Telegraph, being faster than Western Union, and neighbors began arriving with small offerings and large indignation. Mr. Henley brought sugar, claiming his wife had ordered too much. The widow Patterson contributed a box of canning jars she couldn't possibly use all of. Even gruff old Pete from the furthest homestead brought vinegar, muttering about taxation being theft and Briggs being a parasite. We take care of our own, Mrs. Henley said firmly, helping Evelyn sort supplies in the kitchen, while Clara labeled jars with her careful handwriting. And you're one of us now, whether you arrived conventional or not. The work was brutal. Evelyn's days began before dawn making breakfast, then immediately starting on whatever preserving project was most urgent. Strawberry jam from the wild berries Clara gathered, pickled vegetables from the garden they'd frantically expanded, butter churned until her arms ached, then molded into pretty pats that Mrs. Henley swore city folks would pay extra for. Samuel helped when he could, though ranch work didn't pause for side ventures. He'd find her in the kitchen at midnight, still stirring a pot of preserves, and wordlessly take over so she could rest. Or she'd discover he'd already milked the cows at dawn, leaving the cream for her butter making. They developed a rhythm of cooperation that didn't require words, just understanding. Clara proved invaluable, her small fingers perfect for detailed work like tying cloth covers on jars with ribbon. She also had an unexpected talent for sales, charming customers at the general store with earnest descriptions of how the preserves were made, with love and desperation in equal measure, which she seemed to think was a selling point. 2 weeks into their venture, they'd made $37. It seemed both like a fortune and nowhere near enough. At this rate, we'll have the money by winter, Samuel said, discouraged. Then we increased the rate. Evelyn was stirring a pot of apple butter, her hair escaping from its pins, sweat beading on her forehead despite the early morning coolness. The church social is this weekend. If we can sell directly to people there. I don't go to church socials. You do now. He looked at her, this woman who'd arrived with nothing and was now ordering him around his own kitchen, and surprised them both by almost smiling. Yes, ma'am. The church social was held on the grounds of Dustmere's only church, a white clapboard building that looked like it had been dropped from heaven and landed slightly crooked. The entire town turned out partly for worship, but mostly for gossip and food. Evelyn had insisted they all dress in their best Samuel, in a shirt she'd pressed until it could stand on its own. Clara in a dress Evelyn had let out to accommodate her growth, and Evelyn herself in the blue dress that had started all this now cleaned and mended until it looked almost respectable. They set up their table under Mrs. Henley's enthusiastic direction jars of preserves catching the sunlight like jeweled offerings. Clara had made a sign, "Callahan Ranch Goods Made with Care." At first people just looked, some with curiosity, others with the kind of pity Evelyn had learned to recognize and ignore. But then Reverend Morrison's wife bought a jar of strawberry jam, declaring loudly that it was the best she'd ever tasted. That broke the dam. Soon there was a crowd, and Evelyn was making change as fast as her fingers could move. "Is it true you're the bride from the station?" one woman asked, not unkindly, but with obvious curiosity. "I was," Evelyn said simply. "Now I'm the woman who makes the best apple butter in the territory." "Bold claim," the woman said, but she bought 2 jars. Samuel stood slightly apart, uncomfortable with the social aspect, but protective of their small enterprise. When Marcus Briggs appeared moving through the crowd like oil through water, Samuel stepped closer to the table. "Quite the little business," Briggs said, picking up a jar and examining it like he was looking for flaws. "Though I wonder if you've paid the proper licensing fees for commercial sales." "We're selling farm goods at a church social," Evelyn said before Samuel could respond. "Last I checked, that didn't require territorial approval." "Everything requires approval, Miss Price. Or is it Mrs. Callahan now?" Hard to keep track of these informal arrangements. The crowd around their table had gone quiet, that particular prairie silence that preceded either storms or violence. "The arrangement," Samuel said, his voice carrying despite its quiet tone, "is that Miss Price is employed at the ranch. The fact that she's generous enough to help with additional ventures to pay taxes that weren't due for months yet is testament to her character, though I doubt you'd recognize character if it bit you." Briggs's face flushed red. 2 weeks, Callahan. Have my money or lose the ranch." "We'll have it," Clara piped up, startling everyone. "Every penny you overinflated tax leech." The silence that followed was deafening. Then old Pete started laughing, a rusty sound like a gate that hadn't been opened in years. Others joined in, and suddenly Briggs was surrounded by laughter, not cruel but dismissive, which was somehow worse. He left without another word, and the crowd returned to buying preserves with renewed enthusiasm, as if purchasing jam was an act of rebellion against territorial overreach. By the end of the social, they'd made $42. Combined with what they'd already earned and Clara's contribution, they had $94. Still not enough, but closer. That night, as they counted money at the kitchen table, Clara asleep with her head on her arms, Samuel looked at Evelyn with something approaching wonder. "You did this," he said. "We did this." "No." He shook his head. "I'd have given up, sold, what I could probably lost the ranch eventually anyway. You saw a different way." "I saw what was already here, just waiting to be used." She gestured around the kitchen at the empty jars waiting to be filled, the cloth covers Clara had cut, the evidence of their shared labor. "This was all Sarah's foundation. I just built on it." Samuel's jaw tightened at his wife's name, but not with the old pain. This was something else, something that looked like acceptance. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. "Sarah, she would have liked your spine." "My spine?" "The way you stand up to things. Briggs that cow the work. Even me." He paused, seeming to wrestle with words. "Especially me." Before Evelyn could respond, Clara stirred, mumbling something about needing more labels. Samuel scooped her up with the easy strength of long practice. "I'll put her to bed," he said, but paused at the doorway. "Evelyn." "Yes." "Thank you for seeing what could be instead of what was." The next week brought a development no one had anticipated. A letter arrived for Evelyn, forwarded from the station, thick with the kind of paper that suggested money and importance. The return address was Philadelphia, from a law firm she didn't recognize. She opened it with trembling fingers, aware of Samuel watching from across the room, where he was pretending to fix a harness that didn't need fixing. "It's from my great-aunt's estate," she said, reading in disbelief. "Aunt Millicent. I barely knew her. She and my father had some falling out before I was born, but she's died and left me $200. The exact amount they needed. The coincidence felt like either divine intervention or cosmic mockery. "That's wonderful," Samuel said carefully. You can go back east now. Start over properly. Evelyn looked up from the letter to find him turned away, his shoulders rigid with tension. Is that what you think I want to leave? It's what you should want. This, he gestured around the kitchen at the preserving supplies, the evidence of their hard work. This isn't a life, it's just survival. And what's wrong with survival if you're surviving with people who matter? Clara appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of raised voices. Are you leaving? She asked Evelyn, her voice small and scared. No, Evelyn said firmly, then looked at Samuel. Unless I'm being asked to. The silence stretched like taffy, sweet and difficult to navigate. Finally, Samuel turned around and his eyes held something that might have been fear, or might have been hope, or might have been both tangled together like fishing line. I'm not asking you to leave, he said. I'm saying you should. There's a difference. The difference being, one's about what makes sense, the other's about what I want. And what do you want? Clara looked between them like she was watching a tennis match played with words instead of balls. Samuel seemed to crumble and solidify at the same time like a wall that falls only to reveal stronger stone beneath. I want you to stay. God help me, I want you to stay. But not because you've got nowhere else to go. Not because we need your money or your help or your preserves. I want you to stay because he stopped, words failing him like they always did when it mattered most. Because why? Evelyn pressed, stepping closer. Because this place makes sense when you're here, he said in a rush. Because Clara smiles again. Because I don't feel like I'm drowning every minute of every day. Because you see this life as something more than just endurance, and when you're here, I start to see it that way too. Evelyn felt her heart doing something complicated in her chest, like it was trying to remember a dance it had never quite learned. I have a proposal, she said, her voice steadier than her hands. A business proposal. Samuel's expression shuddered slightly. Business. We use the money to pay Briggs all of it. That saves the ranch. In exchange, I become a full partner, not an employee, not a guest. A partner. In the ranch and the preserves business, in, she paused, meeting his eyes, in whatever this is becoming. Partners. Samuel repeated, testing the word. Equal partners. My name on the deed alongside yours. That's not how things are done. Nothing about how I arrived here was how things are done. Why start being conventional now? Clara, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly burst out, Say yes, Daddy. Say yes before she changes her mind and we lose everything. Samuel looked at his daughter, then at Evelyn, who stood there in her flour-dusted apron with her hair coming undone and her chin raised like she was ready to fight the world. His wife had been nothing like this woman. Sarah had been gentle, soft-spoken, a spring rain to Evelyn's summer storm. But maybe that's what they needed now, someone who could stand up to the drought that grief had brought. Partners? He agreed, extending his hand. Evelyn shook it. Her hand small but firm in his, and if they held on a moment longer than business required, only Clara noticed, and she was too busy dancing around the kitchen to comment. They paid Briggs the next day, Evelyn insisting on going along to witness the transaction. The tax assessor's face when he realized the desperate ranch had raised his blood money was almost worth the months of worry. He counted the bills 3 times, looking for some reason to refuse them. This doesn't mean you're safe, he said finally. Taxes come due every year, and we'll pay them every year, Evelyn said, with preserve money if necessary. The territorial government doesn't run on jam, Miss Price. No, but it apparently runs on squeezing families until they break. I'd say jam is the more honorable currency. Briggs left without another word, but his expression promised this wasn't over. On the ride back to the ranch, Samuel was quiet. Finally, as they reached the gate, he said, You didn't have to give all of it. The inheritance. You could have kept some back had security. I have security, Evelyn said. I have a partnership in a ranch, a thriving preserves business, and a family that needs me. What more security could I want? A family, Samuel repeated softly. Is that what we are? Aren't we? We fight like family, work like family, protect each other like family. Just because we came together unconventionally doesn't make it less real. No, he agreed. It doesn't. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching Clara chase fireflies, Samuel pulled something from his pocket. It was a ring, but not his mother's gold one. This was carved from wood smooth and simple. I made this, he said, not quite looking at her. It's not much, but I thought, if we're partners, there should be something to mark it. Evelyn took the ring, feeling the careful workmanship, the hours that must have gone into making something so smooth from something so rough. It's perfect, she said, and meant it. She slipped it onto her right hand, not her wedding finger, not yet, but a finger that meant business and partnership and possibility. Samuel watched her, and something in his expression eased like a knot that had been tied too long, finally loosening. "Miss Evelyn," Clara called, running over with a jar full of fireflies. "Look, I caught falling stars. Those are fireflies, sweetheart." "I know, but if you squint, they look like stars that got tired of being so high up and came down to dance." She thrust the jar at Evelyn. "Make a wish." Evelyn looked at the swirling lights, then at Clara's eager face, then at Samuel, who was watching them both with an expression she couldn't quite read, but that made her chest feel too small for her heart. "I don't need to," she said. "It already came true." "What did finding where I belong?" Clara considered this seriously. "Was that what you wished for on the train platform, when you were waiting?" Evelyn thought about those 3 days sitting on that bench, watching her dreams dissolve like sugar in rain. "No," she said honestly. "I wished for something completely different, but sometimes the best gifts are the ones you didn't know to ask for." Samuel stood his hand, finding Evelyn's shoulder, a brief touch, but weighted with meaning. "It's getting late. Clara needs to wash up for bed." "I'm not tired," Clara protested, even as she yawned. "Fireflies are," Evelyn said. "We should let them go so they can sleep." They released the fireflies together, watching them disperse into the darkness. Little points of light spreading across the prairie like hope made visible. And for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Evelyn didn't think about the train that might take her away. She thought about the dawn that would bring another day here in this place that was becoming home, one preserved jar, one shared meal, one wooden ring at a time. The summer heat had settled over Wyoming like a wool blanket, heavy and inescapable. 3 months had passed since Evelyn paid off Briggs, and the ranch had found its rhythm, a careful dance of survival, and something that might have been contentment. But contentment, Evelyn had learned, was fragile as morning frost in July. She discovered the letters by accident, looking for Sarah's recipe box that Clara swore contained the secret to perfect pie crust. The box was in the cellar tucked behind preserving jars, but when Evelyn pulled it free, a bundle of papers fell with it. Letters tied with a faded blue ribbon addressed in Samuel's careful hand to "My dearest Sarah." She shouldn't have read them. She knew that even as her fingers untied the ribbon, even as her eyes found the first words. But grief makes archaeologists of us all searching for clues about how others survived what seems unsurvivable. "I write to you at night." The first letter began dated just weeks after Sarah's death. "The house is so quiet, I can hear my own heartbeat, and it sounds wrong like a clock ticking in an empty room. Clara asked today why you won't wake up. I told her you were sleeping with the angels. She said angels should learn to share. I had no answer for that." Evelyn sat on the cellar floor surrounded by jars of preserves she'd made, reading a dead woman's love letters from the husband who still mourned her. Each letter was a conversation with silence updates about Clara, about the ranch, about the 1,000 small ways life continued despite everything. "Clara learned to braid her own hair today," one read. "It's crooked and loose, but she was so proud. I didn't have the heart to fix it. You would have known how to make it right without making her feel wrong. I never learned that balance." The last letter was dated just a week before Evelyn arrived. "I'm forgetting your voice," Samuel had written. "Yesterday I tried to remember how you laughed, and I couldn't. It's like you're dying again, piece by piece, memory by memory. I'm so angry at you for leaving, and even angrier at myself for being angry. Clara needs more than this ghost I've become. I pray for strength, but all I get is another sunrise I didn't ask for. You weren't supposed to find those." Evelyn looked up to find Samuel on the cellar stairs, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "I was looking for the recipe box, she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They're private." "I know. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have read them aloud." She blinked. "What?" He came down the stairs, each step deliberate. "I write them, but I never read them back. Maybe hearing them in someone else's voice will make them real. Make her real again just for a moment. So Evelyn read her voice steady, even as her heart broke for this man who loved so deeply he had to write letters to nowhere. Samuel sat on an overturned bucket, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking silently as she gave voice to his grief. When she finished, the cellar was quiet except for their breathing. "She wouldn't have liked you," Samuel said suddenly. The word stung more than Evelyn expected. "Oh, not at first. Sarah was jealous as a cat when it came to other women, would have seen you as a threat." He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "But after a while she would have loved you, would have recognized what I'm only just starting to see, which is that you're not here to replace her. You're here to continue what she started. Different melody, same song." Before Evelyn could respond, Clara's voice rang out from above. "Daddy, Miss Evelyn Ryder's coming." They climbed from the cellar to find not Briggs, but something potentially worse. Thomas Hartley. The real Thomas Hartley, very much alive and sitting on an expensive horse, looking exactly like his letters had described. Evelyn's blood turned to ice water. She recognized him from the photograph he'd sent, though he was older, softer, his confident smile now edged with something sharp. "Miss Price," he said, tipping his hat. "Imagine my surprise when I heard my intended bride had taken up residence at the Callahan Ranch." "Your intended bride never existed," Evelyn said, finding her voice. "You wrote to 6 women, Mr. Hartley. I compared letters with 2 of them at the station. Same promises, same lies, different names." His smile didn't waver. "Business correspondence sometimes requires flexibility, but I'm here now ready to honor our agreement." "What agreement?" Samuel stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Evelyn. "The marriage agreement, of course. Miss Price traveled here to marry me. I was delayed by business, but I'm prepared to fulfill my obligations now." Hartley's eyes traveled over the ranch with the calculating gaze of a man counting assets. "Though it seems she's done quite well for herself in my absence." "She's not going anywhere with you," Samuel said, his voice low and dangerous. "That's not your decision, Mr. Callahan. Miss Price and I have a contract." "A contract based on lies," Evelyn said. "You don't even have a ranch." "I do now. Won it in a card game last month. The Baxter place, 40 acres of good land, perfect for a married couple starting fresh." Clara, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Miss Evelyn can't marry you. She's marrying Daddy." The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn felt her face flame. Samuel went rigid, and Hartley's smile widened like a snake unhinging its jaw. "Is that so?" Hartley asked. "Because, from what I hear in town, Miss Price is merely employed here. Unless there's something more. Informal happening." The insinuation was clear ugly, the kind of rumor that could destroy a woman's reputation faster than wildfire consumed prairie grass. "Nothing improper has occurred," Samuel said, each word precise as a hammer blow. "Of course not. But people talk, especially when a young woman lives with a widower, unchaperoned except for a child." Hartley adjusted his gloves with theatrical care. "I'm offering Miss Price respectability. A real marriage, not whatever arrangement you've cobbled together here." "You're offering her lies," Samuel countered. "Same as your letters." "Perhaps. But lies with a wedding ring carry more weight than truth without one." Evelyn felt something snap inside her, that same clarity that had made her follow Clara home all those months ago. "Mr. Hartley," she said, stepping around Samuel despite his attempt to keep her behind him, "I wouldn't marry you if you were the last man in Wyoming. You're a confidence man, a schemer, and probably a dozen other things that wouldn't bear close examination." "Careful, Miss Price. Defamation is a serious charge. Truth isn't defamation. And the truth is, I'd rather be considered a fallen woman living in sin with Samuel Callahan than a respectable wife to someone like you." The words rang across the yard like a bell. Samuel turned to stare at her, and she could feel Clara practically vibrating with excitement beside them. Hartley's face darkened. "You'll regret this, both of you. I don't take rejection well." "Then you should stop proposing to women under false pretenses," Evelyn shot back. He wheeled his horse around but paused before riding off. "This isn't over. I came here for a bride, and I don't leave empty-handed. After he was gone, the three of them stood in the yard like actors who'd forgotten their next lines. "Did you mean it?" Samuel asked quietly. "Which part? The part about preferring to be fallen with me than respectable with him." "Every word." He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, like ice beginning its spring thaw. "Clara, go inside." "But Daddy—" "Inside. Now." The child went, but not before giving Evelyn a thumbs up that was anything but subtle. When they were alone, Samuel took Evelyn's hands. His were shaking slightly, and she realized hers were too. "I'm not good at this," he said. "At words, at feelings, at anything that isn't work and worry. Sarah knew how to read my silences, but I can't ask that of you." "Then don't be silent." He took a breath that seemed to come from his boots. "I love you." The words hung between them, simple and complicated as breathing. "Not the way I love Sarah," he continued quickly. "That was spring rain, necessary and gentle. This is different. This is like wildfire. Terrifying and consuming and absolutely beyond my control. I've been fighting it because it feels like betrayal. But maybe the real betrayal would be letting you leave with him. Or letting you leave at all. Samuel, I know we agreed to partnership business, nothing romantic. I know you came here by accident. I know you deserve better than a broken-down rancher with too much grief and not enough grace. But if you meant what you said about choosing this over respectability..." Evelyn kissed him. It was easier than finding words for the feeling that had been building since the first morning he'd let her fix his burnt eggs. His lips were chapped from sun and wind, and he tasted like coffee and dust and home. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Samuel looked stunned. "Was that a yes?" he asked. "That was a stop talking and kiss me again." He did, pulling her closer, and for a moment the heat wasn't oppressive but necessary, burning away the last of their careful distance. "Daddy? Miss Evelyn, are you done yet?" Clara called from the window. "Because Mr. Henley's coming and you should probably stop doing whatever you're doing." They jumped apart like guilty teenagers, and despite everything, Evelyn laughed. Samuel's mouth quirked in what was almost a smile, and he kept one hand on her waist as Henley's wagon approached. But Henley wasn't alone. Half the town seemed to be with him, Mrs. Holloway, the Pattersons, even Reverend Morrison. They pulled into the yard like a convoy of concern. "We heard Hartley was here," Mrs. Holloway said without preamble. "That confidence man who's been promising marriage to half the desperate women in 3 territories. "He was," Samuel confirmed. "He's gone." "Not far," old Pete said, spitting tobacco juice. "He's at the saloon telling anyone who'll listen that Samuel Callahan stole his bride, making implications about Miss Price's virtue that don't bear repeating." Evelyn felt Samuel tense beside her, his hand moving reflexively toward where his gun would be if he were wearing it. "Don't," she said quietly. "That's what he wants. Violence would prove his point." "Then what do you suggest?" Samuel's voice was tight with controlled fury. Reverend Morrison cleared his throat. "Perhaps a more civilized solution. A public declaration of your intentions might silence the gossips." "What intentions?" Samuel asked, though his hand found Evelyn's. "Marriage intentions," Mrs. Henley said bluntly. "It's been clear as day to anyone with eyes that you two have been dancing around each other for months. Make it official, and Hartley's got no ground to stand on." "We can't marry to spite Thomas Hartley," Evelyn protested. "No," Reverend Morrison agreed. "But you could marry because you love each other and let spiting Hartley be a pleasant side effect." Clara, who'd snuck outside despite orders, tugged on Samuel's shirt. "Daddy, you love Miss Evelyn, right?" Samuel looked down at his daughter, then at Evelyn, then at the assembled neighbors who'd come to defend their reputation. "Yes, he said simply. "I do. And Miss Evelyn, you love my daddy." Evelyn thought about the letters in the cellar about Sarah, who'd loved this man enough to build a life with him in the middle of nowhere, about Thomas Hartley and his false promises, about 3 days on a train platform waiting for something that didn't exist, and about finding something real in the last place she'd expected. "Yes," she said, "I do." "Then what are we waiting for?" Clara demanded. What indeed Evelyn thought. Convention proper mourning periods. The approval of strangers. None of that had brought her here. A child in oversized boots had brought her here, and maybe that was exactly the kind of logic this situation required. Samuel, she said, turning to face him fully, we should talk about this privately. No. His voice was firm. No more private, no more careful. If I'm going to do this, I'm doing it right. He dropped to one knee right there in the dusty yard in front of God and half of Dustmere. Evelyn Price, you came here for the wrong man but found the right life. Would you do me the honor of making it official? Mrs. Holloway gasped. Clara squealed. Old Pete muttered something about it being about damn time. I don't have a ring, Samuel continued, then remembered. Wait, yes, I do. He pulled his mother's gold band from his pocket. He'd been carrying it since the night he'd first offered it to her. This was my mother's. I offered it as collateral once, but I'd rather offer it as a promise. Marry me, Evelyn. Not because of Hartley, not because of gossip, but because you make this broken place whole again. Evelyn looked at this man on his knee in the dust, offering her a ring that meant family and future and forever. She thought about Sarah's letters about the love that had built this ranch. She wasn't replacing that love, she was adding to it like a quilt made from pieces of different lives stitched into something new. Yes, she said. The yard erupted. Clara launched herself at them both, nearly knocking Samuel over. The neighbors cheered. Mrs. Holloway was actually crying, though she'd deny it later. When Shah, Reverend Morrison asked practical, even in celebration. Now? Samuel said, standing and brushing dust from his knees. Today. Before Hartley can cause more trouble. Samuel, I'm wearing my work dress, Evelyn protested. You're perfect, he said, and the way he looked at her made her believe it. They were married an hour later in the church with half the town as witnesses. Clara stood between them, holding their hands like she was the one joining them together, which, in a way, she was. Thomas Hartley heard about the wedding before they'd even finished saying their vows. He left town that night, but not before setting one last cruel plan in motion. The fire started in the barn just after midnight. Evelyn woke to the smell of smoke and Samuel's shout of alarm. They ran outside to find the structure fully engulfed flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like desperate fingers. The horses! Clara screamed. Samuel was already running toward the inferno. Without thinking, Evelyn followed. The heat was like a living thing pushing against them with violent intent. Inside the horses were screaming, panicked, dangerous. Take this one! Samuel shoved a rope into her hands. Lead her out. Don't stop. Don't look back. Evelyn grabbed the rope, pulling a terrified mare toward the door. The horse fought, reared, nearly struck her, but she held on with desperate strength. Behind her, she could hear Samuel fighting to free the other animals, the crack of burning wood, the roar of consuming fire. She got the mare out, handed her off to Clara, and ran back. Samuel was struggling with the last horse, his shirt smoking from proximity to the flames. Get out! He yelled when he saw her. Instead, she grabbed a bucket of water Clara had been filling and doused him with it, then helped him pull the stubborn gelding free. They burst from the barn just as the roof began to collapse, diving away from the shower of sparks and burning debris. They lay in the dirt, gasping, coughing, still holding the horse's rope. The barn continued to burn, but all the animals were safe. You could have died, Samuel said, his voice raw from smoke. So could you. I had to save them. And I had to save you. He pulled her against him, not caring that they were covered in soot and sweat and singed cloth. We're a mess, Sut, he said. We're alive, she countered. We're married, Claire added, having appeared beside them with a bucket of water and her typical timing. For exactly 6 hours now. Samuel laughed, actually laughed, the sound rusty but real. Hell of a wedding night. Language, Daddy. Sorry, Clara Bird. They fought the fire until dawn, the entire community appearing as if summoned by smoke signals. They saved the house, the other outbuildings, but the barn was gone. As the sun rose illuminating the smoldering ruins, Evelyn saw something glinting in the ashes. It was a pocket watch, one she recognized from Thomas Hartley's vest. He'd been careless, left evidence of his arson. We could have him arrested, Samuel said when she showed him. We could, Evelyn agreed. Or we could let him run, knowing that we survived his worst and came out stronger. That's very forgiving of you. Not forgiving, practical. Hartley's the kind of man who creates his own punishment. We don't need to help. They stood together looking at the destroyed barn. It would take months to rebuild money. They didn't have labor they could barely spare. But neighbors were already talking about a barn raising, and old Pete was calculating lumber needs, and Mrs. Holloway was organizing food committees. We'll rebuild, Samuel said. Better than before. Different than before, Evelyn corrected. But yes, better. He kissed her temple gentle despite everything. I'm sorry this isn't the life you expected when you answered that advertisement. Evelyn thought about those foolish dreams of romance and adventure, of a handsome stranger who would sweep her into a fairy tale. Instead, she'd found a grieving widower, a precocious child, and a ranch that demanded everything and promised nothing except more work tomorrow. No, she said, it's infinitely better. The barn raising happened 2 weeks later. The entire county showed up, even people they'd never met, drawn by the story of the bride from the station who'd married the grieving rancher and fought fire on her wedding night. By sunset, a new barn stood where the old one had burned, built by community and consecrated by hope. That night, as they stood on the porch watching Clara chase fireflies with the Henley children, Samuel pulled out another letter. But this one wasn't addressed to Sarah. What's that, Evelyn asked. Something I wrote this morning. He handed it to her, looking almost shy. My dearest Evelyn, she read aloud. Today I watched you teaching Clara to make preserves, and she laughed when jam splattered your nose. It was Sarah's laugh, but Clara's joy, and for the first time the echo didn't hurt. You've taught us that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting that new love doesn't diminish old love, that a heart can be broken and whole at the same time. I don't write to Sarah anymore. I talk to her sometimes when I'm alone, but I don't need letters to nowhere when I have love right here. Thank you for waiting on that platform. Thank you for following Clara home. Thank you for choosing us when you could have chosen anywhere else. Your devoted husband. I'm still getting used to writing that, Samuel. Evelyn was crying by the time she finished reading, but they were the kind of tears that watered good things. You found your words, she said. You gave them back to me. Clara ran up then, jar of fireflies in hand. Look, I caught enough to light the whole house. Those are for outside little bird, Samuel said, but he was smiling. Everything good's for outside, Clara declared. That's why we live in Wyoming. It was child's logic, but it made its own sense. They were outside people now, Evelyn realized. People who faced storms head on, who rebuilt what burned, who found love in the most unexpected places. Tell me the story, Claire demanded, settling between them on the porch step. What story? Evelyn asked. The one about how you came to us, about waiting and finding and choosing. So Evelyn told it with Samuel adding details she'd forgotten or never knew. How desperate he'd been that morning Clara disappeared. How he'd almost gone to the station himself but couldn't face the possibility of Clara not being there. How he'd known the moment he saw Evelyn teaching Clara to braid hair that their lives had changed forever. But you didn't say anything, Evelyn protested. I was scared, he admitted. Scared of hoping again, scared of losing again, just scared. Not anymore. Still scared, he said, taking her hand, but brave enough to be scared and choose love anyway. The fireflies rose around them like tiny celebrations, and Clara released her captured ones to join the dance. They sat on the porch of their fire-tested, community-built, love-sustained home, watching light triumph over darkness in the smallest, most persistent ways. We should go to bed, Samuel said eventually. Dawn comes early. Dawn always comes, Evelyn agreed, standing and pulling him up with her. That's the promise. They went inside Clara, chattering about tomorrow's plans. Samuel's hand warm on Evelyn's back, the wooden ring on her right hand and gold on her left, catching the last of the light. Behind them, the new barn stood solid against the darkening sky, built on ashes, but reaching toward stars. The first snow came early that year, October barely gone when white began dusting the mountains like flour on a baker's table. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach, watching Samuel and Clara work to bring the cattle closer to home. 6 months married, and she still sometimes forgot she belonged here, that the name Callahan was hers now, too. The discovery of her pregnancy had been typically understated. She'd fainted while making preserves. Samuel had caught her before she hit the floor, and Doc Morrison had been summoned with all the panic of a man who'd already lost one wife. But the doctor's prognosis had been cheerful. Healthy as a horse, he'd declared, and probably twice as stubborn knowing you, Mrs. Callahan. Claire had taken the news with the solemnity of a child given great responsibility. "I'm going to be the best big sister," she'd announced. "I'll teach the baby everything: how to milk cows, how to spot good preserving berries, how to know when Daddy's pretending he's not hurt so he doesn't worry us." That last observation had made Samuel flush and mutter something about children seeing too much. But he'd been gentler since then, watchful, in a way that might have been irritating if it wasn't so clearly born of fear. Now, watching them work together in the pre-winter light, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of perfect contentment. Then she saw the riders approaching from the east, and her hand instinctively went to the rifle they kept by the door. But as the group drew closer, she recognized the lead rider's distinctive hat. Marcus Briggs. Because of course he was. Some men were like bad pennies, always turning up when least wanted. "Samuel, she called, stepping onto the porch despite the cold. Her husband looked up, saw the riders, and his whole body changed from relaxed to ready in the space of a heartbeat. He said something to Clara, who ran toward the house while he walked to meet Briggs, deliberately slow, deliberately calm. "Mrs. Callahan," Briggs said, tipping his hat with mock courtesy when he reached speaking distance. "Heard congratulations are in order, marriage and a baby on the way. How efficient?" "Mr. Briggs," Evelyn replied evenly. "To what do we owe the displeasure?" His smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Official business. There's been a claim filed against this property. Seems there's some question about the legitimacy of your husband's ownership." Samuel had reached them by then, positioning himself slightly in front of Evelyn. "My family has worked this land for 20 years. "Yes, but do you have the papers to prove it?" Amazing how many documents got lost in that fire. The barn wasn't the only thing that burned that night, was it? The implication hung in the cold air. They'd kept their important papers in a strongbox in the barn, deed contracts, proof of ownership, all ash now. "The territorial office has copies," Samuel said. "Funny thing about that, there was a fire there too just last week. Very selective fire, only destroyed certain records, yours among them." Briggs produced a document from his coat. "Which is why this new claim has merit. Mr. Thomas Hartley says this land was promised to him as part of a marriage contract with Miss Price. Excuse me, Mrs. Callahan." "That's absurd," Evelyn said. "I never promised him land I didn't own." "No, but he claims Samuel here manipulated you, took advantage of a desperate woman, stole both bride and the property that should have been his." Briggs's eyes glittered with malicious pleasure. "He's demanding either the land or compensation. Say $5,000. 5,000. Samuel's voice was dangerously quiet. "We don't have that kind of money." "Then you have 60 days to vacate, unless—" Briggs paused, savoring the moment. "You can prove your prior claim. Original documentation, witnesses to the initial purchase, something that proves definitively that this land is yours." Clara, who'd been listening from the doorway despite being told to stay inside, suddenly spoke up. "Grandpa's marker." All three adults turned to look at her. "Daddy's father," she explained, excitement making her words tumble together. "He carved the claim marker when he first got here. It's got the date and everything. Mama showed me once. It's buried under the big oak by the creek where they first made camp. She said it was like our family's beginning carved in stone." Samuel's face transformed with hope. "I'd forgotten. Father was meticulous about that, said a man's claim should be carved in something that would outlast him." "A rock with some scratches," Briggs scoffed. "That won't hold up in court." "It will if it matches the original survey records," Evelyn said, her mind racing. "The surveyor would have noted any existing markers. Those records are federal, not territorial. You'd have to burn down offices all the way to Washington to destroy them all." Briggs's face darkened. 60 days. Have your proof, or have your bags packed?" After he left trailing threats like dust, the three of them stood in the kitchen, the weight of potential loss heavy as the coming snow. "We need to find that marker," Samuel said. The ground's nearly frozen, Evelyn pointed out. And you said the oak was by the creek that's under 2 feet of autumn flooding right now. Then we wait for it to recede or we dig underwater. His jaw was set in the stubborn line she'd come to recognize. I'm not losing this place. Not to Briggs, not to Hartley, not to anyone. We're not, Evelyn corrected gently. We're not losing it. That night, unable to sleep, she found herself in the room they'd prepared for the baby. It wasn't much yet. A crib Samuel had started building a quilt she'd begun piecing together from scraps of their old lives. Clara's outgrown baby clothes saved by Sarah and discovered in a trunk. The history of this family waiting for its next chapter. Samuel found her there sitting in the rocking chair he'd repaired. Can't sleep either, he asked. The baby's restless. Probably knows something's wrong. He knelt beside the chair, one hand gentle on her stomach. Nothing's wrong. We've faced worse. Have we? We survived Thomas Hartley. We survived the fire. We survived grief and loneliness and 3 days on a train platform. His voice was soft but certain. We'll survive this too. What if we can't find the marker? What if it's been destroyed or moved or... Then we'll find another way. There's always another way. He stood pulling her up with him. Come back to bed. You need rest. I need certainty. Nobody gets that. All we get is the next day and the chance to fight for what matters. The next morning brought unexpected allies. Word of Briggs's threat had spread Prairie Telegraph working overtime, and neighbors began arriving with information and offers of help. Old Pete claimed to remember Samuel's father setting the marker. Watched him carve it myself. Put the date, his name, and something else. A symbol, maybe, can't quite recall. Mrs. Holloway brought food and fierce indignation. That Briggs has been trying to run families off good land for years. About time someone stood up to him. Even the Reverend came offering to write a letter attesting to the family's long presence on the land. I baptized Clara here, buried Sarah here. This is Callahan land in every way that matters to God. But it was Mr. Henley who brought the most practical help. I've got a team of men who can help dig for the marker. That creek's going to be a bear to redirect, but we've done it before during the drought of '71. We can't pay a... Samuel started. Nobody's asking you to. This is neighbor helping neighbor. Today, you, tomorrow, maybe me. The work began immediately despite the cold. Men from 5 different ranches worked to build a temporary dam, redirecting the creek enough to expose the muddy ground beneath. Samuel and Evelyn searched through old photographs, trying to identify exactly which oak Sarah had meant there were 3 large ones along the creek, and 20 years of growth had changed the landscape. Clara appointed herself keeper of morale, bringing coffee and encouragement in equal measure. You're getting warmer, Suck, she'd say, though she had no more idea than anyone where the marker was. On the 3rd day of searching, with the ground frozen and everyone's spirits flagging, Evelyn noticed something. In one of Sarah's photographs, the one from their first Christmas on the ranch, there was a distinctive knot in one of the oak trees shaped like a heart. She'd thought it romantic nonsense when she first saw it, but now... Samuel. She called, "Look at this." He studied the photograph, then looked at the trees. The middle oak had a similar knot, weathered and expanded, but still recognizably heart-shaped. "That's it," he breathed. "That's the one." They dug carefully, the frozen earth fighting them every inch. The men took turns making slow progress as the day wore on. Just as the sun began to set, painting the sky, the color of old roses, Pete's shovel hit something solid. "Stone!" he called out. They excavated carefully, revealing a piece of granite the size of a dinner plate carved with clear, deep letters, Jonathan Callahan, October 15th, 1854, first claim. Below the text was a symbol, a circle with a cross through it, the surveyor's mark for a verified claim. The cheer that went up could probably be heard in town. Clara danced around the muddy hole. Samuel pulled Evelyn into a fierce embrace, and even stoic old Pete might have wiped at his eyes. "We need to get this to the federal office in Cheyenne," Samuel said, "before Briggs can interfere." "I'll take it," Henley offered. "My brother works in the records office. We can have it verified and documented before Briggs even knows it's been found." But Briggs, they discovered, had eyes everywhere. The next morning, Henley's wagon was found overturned on the road to Cheyenne, though Henley himself had managed to escape with only bruises. The marker was gone. He can't just steal it, Clara protested, tears streaming down her face. He just did, Samuel said grimly. Evelyn, however, was thinking. He stole the stone, but he can't steal what we saw. We have witnesses, a dozen men who saw that marker who can testify to what it said. Testimony against physical evidence, Briggs will produce some fake marker that says something different. Then we need something else. Something Briggs doesn't know about. She turned to Clara. You said your mother showed you the marker. Did she say anything else about it? Any other proof your grandfather left? Clara screwed up her face, thinking hard. She said Grandpa was smart, said he knew claim jumpers would try to steal land, so he left insurance. Insurance? That's the word she used, said it was buried deeper than roots but higher than hope. Clara shrugged. Mama sometimes said things that sounded pretty but didn't make sense. Samuel, however, had gone very still. Buried deeper than roots but higher than hope. My father used to say that about faith, that you had to plant it deep but let it reach high. The church, Evelyn breathed. He buried something at the church. They rode to the small church in town, Reverend Morrison meeting them with concern. Of course you can look, he said when they explained. Though I don't know what you'd find. The church was built in '56, just 2 years after your father's claim. That's exactly when he'd have done it, Samuel said. He donated the land for the church, helped build it. He'd have had opportunity. They searched for hours looking for loose stones, hidden compartments, anything that might hide 20-year-old proof. It was Clara who found it naturally children saw things adults missed. Why is this stone different? She asked, pointing to a cornerstone that was slightly darker than the others. Samuel knelt, running his fingers over the stone. There were letters carved into it, worn but readable, J.C. 1854, Truth Endures. Help me, he said to Reverend Morrison. Together they worked the stone loose, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside was an oilcloth package, brittle with age but intact. With shaking hands, Samuel unwrapped it. Inside were two things: a surveyor's certificate signed and sealed, confirming Jonathan Callahan's claim to the land, and a letter in his father's careful script. If you're reading this, Samuel read aloud, then someone has tried to steal what we've built. Know that this land was bought honest, worked honest, and should pass honest to the next generation. The official record is here witnessed by God and government both. Let any man who says otherwise answer to both. Jonathan Callahan. This is perfect, Reverend Morrison said. With this and the witness testimony about the marker, no court would side with Briggs. But Evelyn was reading the surveyor's certificate more carefully. Samuel, look at this. The land description, it includes 40 acres that were not currently working. The eastern section past the creek. Samuel studied the document. Father always said he bought more than he could work, planning for the future. But after he died, Mother and I just maintained what we could manage. I'd forgotten about the eastern section. Briggs doesn't know about it either, Evelyn said, a plan forming. He's trying to steal land he doesn't even know the extent of. The confrontation came 2 days later in the territorial courthouse. Briggs had indeed produced a marker crudely carved and obviously new, claiming the land for Thomas Hartley in 1853, a year before Jonathan Callahan's claim. Interesting, the federal judge said dryly. Mr. Hartley claimed land in Wyoming territory before it was officially opened for settlement. Quite prescient of him. Briggs' face went red. The date could be wrong. Indeed. Many things about your evidence seem wrong, Mr. Briggs. The judge turned to Samuel. I understand you have documentation. Samuel presented the surveyor's certificate, the letter, and the sworn testimony of 13 men who'd seen the original marker. But it was Evelyn who delivered the killing blow. Your Honor, she said, standing despite Samuel's attempt to keep her seated. She was showing now obviously pregnant, and he worried constantly. We'd like to submit an additional piece of evidence. Mr. Briggs and Mr. Hartley claim to know this land well enough to own it. I propose a test. Let them draw the boundaries of the claim they're making. If they truly have legitimate interest in this specific piece of land, surely they know its extent. The judge, intrigued, agreed. Briggs and Hartley huddled together, then drew a rough map that encompassed the main ranch buildings and the grazing land currently in use. Now, Mr. Callahan, the judge said, show us your understanding of your land. Samuel drew not just the developed land, but the entire original claim, including the eastern 40 acres. He described landmarks, water sources, the location of the original marker details only someone who'd lived on and loved the land could know. Furthermore, Evelyn added, I'd like to point out that Mr. Hartley sent letters to multiple women, myself included, promising marriage and land he didn't own. This is simply his latest attempt at fraud, now aided by Mr. Briggs for reasons I can only assume involve money or spite. She produced her original letters from Hartley, plus 2 more sets from women she'd contacted in other territories, all containing identical promises and lies. The judge's decision was swift. This court finds in favor of Samuel and Evelyn Callahan. The land in question belongs to them by right of original claim, continuous occupation, and legal documentation. Furthermore, Mr. Briggs, your position as tax assessor is hereby terminated pending investigation into corruption and attempted fraud. Mr. Hartley, you're under arrest for mail fraud and conspiracy to commit theft. The courtroom erupted. Hartley tried to run, but was caught by old Pete, who'd been hoping for just such an opportunity. Briggs stood frozen, his carefully built empire of intimidation crumbling in minutes. This isn't over, he snarled at Samuel. Yes, Samuel said quietly, it is. Outside the courthouse, Clara jumped into her parents' arms, nearly knocking them over. We won, we won. We kept what was ours, Samuel corrected, but he was smiling wider than Evelyn had ever seen. And gained something we didn't know we had, Evelyn added, thinking of those eastern 40 acres. The ride home was triumphant but exhausting. Evelyn dozed against Samuel's shoulder while Clara chattered with the Henleys, who'd insisted on escorting them back. She woke to Samuel's gentle shake. We're home, he said, and the word had never sounded sweeter. But standing on their porch was a woman Evelyn had never seen before, elderly, well-dressed, with eyes that were startlingly familiar. Hello, Samuel, the woman said. I'm sorry to arrive unannounced, but when I heard about the court case, I had to come. Samuel had gone rigid. Aunt Margaret, Sarah's mother, the woman confirmed, and Evelyn understood the familiar eyes. They were Sarah's eyes, Clara's eyes, honey gold and knowing. Grandmother, Clara breathed, wonder and confusion mixing in her voice. Margaret's composure cracked. Oh, my dear girl, you look just like her. The reunion was awkward, weighted with years of absence. Margaret had disapproved of Sarah marrying a rancher, had cut contact when Sarah refused to return to Boston. She'd learned of Sarah's death months after the fact, too late for the funeral, too proud to come grovel for forgiveness. But I've been following your struggles, she said over coffee, that Evelyn had somehow managed to make despite exhaustion. The newspaper in Cheyenne carried the story about the bride from the station who saved a failing ranch. When I realized it was Samuel's ranch, Sarah's home, I knew I had to come. Why now? Samuel's voice was carefully neutral, but Evelyn could see the tension in his shoulders. Because I'm old and tired of being proud and alone, Margaret said simply. Because I have money that could help and no one else to leave it to. Because I want to know my granddaughter before it's too late. She produced a bank draft that made Evelyn gasp. This is far too much. It's what Sarah would have inherited, what she gave up to follow her heart. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I was so angry that she chose love over comfort. But looking at this place, at what you've built and rebuilt and fought for, I understand now. This is what love looks like. Not grand gestures, but daily choices to stay, to work, to hope. Clara, who'd been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke. Mama talked about you. Said you smelled like roses and read her stories about princesses. Margaret broke down completely then, and it was Clara who went to her small arms, offering comfort to the grandmother she'd never thought to meet. You can stay, Clara said firmly. We have room. Mama Evelyn, made the spare room nice again. The word mama hung in the air. Clara had been trying it out for weeks, never quite settling on what to call the woman who'd married her father. Is that okay? Clara asked Evelyn. Mama Evelyn. Since I'll need to teach the baby the difference between you and Mama who died. It's perfect, Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. Margaret stayed for a week. That became a month, that became a permanent arrangement. She took over the household accounts, freeing Evelyn to focus on her expanding preserves business and her expanding belly. She taught Clara the things Sarah hadn't lived long enough to teach embroidery poetry, the proper way to set a table for company. Not that we have much company, Clara pointed out. That will change, Margaret predicted. She was right. As November deepened into December, the Callahan Ranch became a gathering place. The success against Briggs had made them symbols of resistance against corruption. People came for advice for hope for Evelyn's preserves and Margaret's Boston wisdom and Samuel's quiet strength. Thomas Hartley was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Briggs fled the territory before he could be arrested, but rumors placed him in California trying the same schemes on new victims. Good riddance, old Pete said, becoming a regular at their dinner table along with the Henleys and the widow Patterson. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling soft as flour and the house warm with fire and fellowship, Samuel stood to make a toast. The parlor was full neighbors' friends, the family they'd chosen and the family they'd found. A year ago, he said, this house was silent. Clara and I went through the motions of living without really being alive. Then a woman got off a train with nowhere to go and everything to give. She didn't save us, we saved each other. We saved ourselves. But mostly we learned that family isn't just about blood or promises or even love. It's about choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. It's about fighting for each other when fighting alone would be safer. It's about building something from ashes and believing it will stand. He raised his glass to Evelyn, who was radiant despite being enormously pregnant. To my wife, who waited for the wrong man and found the right life. To Samuel, Evelyn countered, who had the courage to love again when loss seemed safer. To Clara, Margaret added, tears streaming down her face, who brought us all together with the wisdom of a child and the heart of a lion. To the baby, Clara said, not to be outdone, who's going to be born into the best family in Wyoming, even if we're a little odd. Especially because we're odd, Samuel corrected, and everyone laughed. Later, after the guests had gone and Margaret had taken Clara up to bed, Samuel and Evelyn sat by the fire, her head on his shoulder, his hand gentle on her belly. Do you ever think about how different it all could have been? He asked. If Hartley had been real, if you'd never come here. Every day, Evelyn admitted, and every day I'm grateful he was a lie. The truth brought me better things than fiction ever could. The baby kicked strong and insistent, and Samuel smiled the full, real smile that had become common in recent months. Strong like its mother, he said. Stubborn like its father, she countered. Lucky, he said, kissing her temple like us all. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the land in pristine white, hiding the scars of fire and struggle under a blanket of new possibility. The ranch slept peaceful and protected home to a family stitched together from loss and hope in equal measure. In the spring, there would be a baby. In the summer, the eastern 40 acres to develop. In the fall, another harvest, another chance to build and grow and become. But tonight, in the warmth of Christmas Eve, there was just this love that had grown from desperation family, that had formed from fragments, and the quiet certainty that some destinations are worth every wrong turn that leads you to them. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight Christmas, arriving with gentle insistence. Samuel stood, pulling Evelyn up with careful attention to her condition. Where are we going? She asked. To see something. He wrapped her in Sarah's old coat, now hers, now part of the continuing story, and led her onto the porch. There in the snow, Clara and Margaret had built a snow family, 5 figures of varying sizes holding hands. 5, Evelyn asked. Clara says the baby's definitely a boy, Samuel explained. She's usually right about these things. And the 5th figure, that's Sarah, he said simply. Clara said she's still part of our family, just in a different way, like how spring is still there even in winter, just waiting underneath. Evelyn leaned into him, feeling the baby shift and settle, feeling the weight of all they'd built and fought for and won. She's right. Love doesn't leave. It just changes shape. Like water, Samuel agreed. Sometimes ice, sometimes steam, sometimes rain, but always water. They stood there watching snow erase the old year and write the beginning of the new, a family forged not from perfection, but from persistence, not from plans, but from the beautiful accident of 3 days on a train platform, and a little girl brave enough to ask a stranger to come home.